products to create that harm are where you start, and then it's proportionate, meaning that we are both looking at how we support those who are at highest risk while also making space for innovation and growth. So I'll stop there as the initial comments, but I look forward to additional conversation on those topics.
That's a very good opener. Thank you. Let's turn to you now, Mr. Sherman.
Well, Chair and members of the committee, thank you and good afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk with you about AI and human rights. I think there's probably not a more important topic to think about as we are building this technology for all of Britain, but also all of the world. And so just really appreciate both the opportunity to be here and also the committee's attention to this important topic. When I think about the role of AI, and particularly the way the UK has approached it through the Opportunities Plan, which, as the committee will know, was recently updated, I think it's a really thoughtful and sensible approach, and in some ways a global model. If you look at the way that the Opportunities Plan is approaching AI, it's recognizing we're at an inflection point. We're at an inflection point where the technology has the opportunity to be pivotal and enable access and voice in ways that just were never possible before, and economic growth as well here in the UK. And so it's an important opportunity to both leverage that technology to enable people across the country, at the same time recognizes that there are real risks associated with the technology and we need to be thoughtful about it. And two things that I think are particularly helpful about the approach outlined in the Opportunities Plan. The first is, in contrast to some other jurisdictions in the world, the approach is to leverage the expertise that exists in the government and that exists in government agencies to regulate. AI is going to become a part of almost every sector, every technology that we use. And so making sure that we're empowering the government agencies that have expertise in those areas to enforce, I think, is one important area.
Mr. Sherman, that's really helpful. Your reference that you just made to other jurisdictions, is there a jurisdiction anywhere that you would point us to and say, they're doing exactly the right thing in terms of protecting human rights?
I certainly wouldn't say that human rights is a solved problem anywhere in the world. I think that it is an important area of focus for all of us. And so while I am quite impressed with the approach that the UK government has taken and the approach so far, I think this is something that we need to continue to collaborate on, and I don't think there's a single model that I would point to. The other thing, Chair, that I would also mention that I think is an important attribute of the UK's approach, which is important for protecting the public and also for human rights, is the UK's AI Security Institute, which I think is a global thought leader at this point in thinking about how to build AI systems responsibly, and particularly building technical governance to make sure that as systems are built, they guard against the kinds of risks that we all worry about.
Thank you very much. And perhaps when Ms. Badanes comes to answer the next question, she can also tell us if there's anywhere at all in the world that we should be looking at that would be an exemplar. But let's go to Sir Desmond, and after that, we'll go to Dame Chi.
Got two questions. And the first is, I want to know, and I believe that I have a right to know, if the results of which I'm the beneficiary or the victim have been delivered by processing using artificial intelligence. Is that a legitimate expectation?
I think transparency is a critically important part of people's experience with AI, in part because they won't have confidence in using the services that we offer if we're not transparent about how they work. And so when people interact with AI in our services, whether that's through a chatbot or in other experiences, we do make sure that it's clear that they're interacting with AI. It's important to note that there's other forms of AI that are used in other ways on our products and services. So, for example, AI is used to help decide what content you see in your news feed on Facebook so that you're seeing things that are interesting to you, and that's going to be different than what's interesting to me. Similarly, we use AI as a part of our content enforcement and our integrity efforts to keep people safe on the platform. In those cases, AI is part of the puzzle, but there's also human involvement. And typically when we take those actions, we also try to be transparent about the reasons why the actions were taken and give people recourse.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I think it breaks into a few different categories when it comes to what your rights are in that situation. First is the question of when should somebody know? Essentially, I think if AI materially shapes an outcome, so for example, that affects your rights. So for example, decisions about opportunities or jobs, that's an opportunity where you should know that AI had something to do with that process. I think that is something that you deserve. And then to the point that was just made, when you're interacting with AI in a way that could be interpreted to be a human, I think you have a right to know that, in fact, you're interacting with an AI in that case. I also think it's important to talk about what transparency actually looks like. And this is a complicated situation, but disclosures are critical. There are a lot of details to be worked through about when disclosures should exist and in what way they should be labeled. But it is an area that a lot of work has gone in, and there's a lot of opportunities for in product notices and limitations and citations where you can. And then I feel like I should add that there's a really critical component around content provenance and watermarking that should be considered here as well. And this is, of course, more for videos and images and audio files. But there is some technology out there that enables technology companies and then platforms who are serving it up to essentially label when something has been created by AI. And I think that that's an area where we should really lean into as well. And then the final point is just more of like the who is responsible for that, because as a reminder, of course, this is a very long supply chain when you're talking about the AI lifecycle. So there are those on the developer side who have responsibilities. There is responsibilities at the deployment side, and then at the platform side as well. And then I'd finally add that there's, of course, always some responsibility with users, particularly those who are attempting to manipulate or mislead with that information that they're using those tools for.
So you've touched on what would have been my second question, which is, so first of all, how do we enforce this? But second, how easy would it be to conceal? Like watermarking, for example, all the way around.
Right. So there is no silver bullet to this question, which is why it is complicated. But so instead of saying yes, watermarking can be manipulated. And if it was the only solution to this problem, then I think we'd be in real trouble. The reality is there is a defense in depth approach that is being recommended as sort of a best practice in this case. And that is that you should have invisible watermarks, you should have visible watermarks, and you should have content provenance applied to it. And there's even a case for fingerprinting in certain cases as well. And when you put all of those things together, if someone chooses to maliciously strip content provenance or does it accidentally, you will have some kind of resilience there because the watermarks still exist, and vice versa. And so we do need to get to a place, to your point, of enforcement, where certainly as a tech industry, but I would say more broadly in collaboration with governments, that we come up with these best practices and enshrine them in a way that we are all following the same principles so that we have that resiliency in our system.
One thing I would add, and I certainly agree with the importance of transparency, one thing that I would add is the importance of multi-layered transparency in terms of both communicating with people who use our services in a number of different ways, but also recognizing there are different people in the ecosystem who need different kinds of transparencies. For example, governments are going to be looking for different things than users, and experts are going to be looking for yet different kinds of transparency. So when we think about this, I agree with the point that was just made on transparency. So when our AI models generate photorealistic images, there's embedded watermarking within the image that identifies it as AI generated. When those images then are shown on Facebook, there's what we call an AI info tool that lets you understand that they're AI generated and get information about that. But then in addition, we also try to publish other kinds of information about other AI uses. I referred earlier to AI when it's used to show you different things in your newsfeed. And in that case, we have a feature called Why Am I Seeing This? That tries to explain to you the AI-driven decisions about what factors caused us to show you that. When it comes to disclosure to governments and experts, there's an additional layer that looks at, we publish transparency reports both about our overall human rights approach, which includes obviously our work on AI, but then also when we release a model, we'll publish details about what are the specific evaluations that we do, what are the specific risks that we looked at, how do we mitigate them? And then finally, I think there's often a concern about AI being a black box. One of our approaches is to open source our models. And I like to think of open sourced models as a glass box instead of a black box, in the sense that even if you don't necessarily trust all of the information that we put out. We hope that you will. But in addition to all of the disclosures that we have about the work that we've done, because models are open source, anybody who wants to can pressure test them and understand how they're working.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to Dame Chi, and after that we'll hear from Dr. Peter Swallow.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the committee for allowing me to guest. It's a great pleasure to be here. And Meta will be before my select committee, I think on March the 11th. I'm not sure whether that will be you, Mr.
Not
Sherman.
aware of it, so it would be a problem if it were me.
But we will be looking at the update to our social media and algorithms inquiry. We've already heard about rights and the multi-layers of technology that go into artificial intelligence. And a really important point for clarity is responsibilities, and particularly when it comes again to the question of regulation. So could you just say to me what your company, and I'll start with you, Mr. Sherman, what your company sees its responsibilities, your responsibilities, when it comes to the impact and outputs, and two separate things, of artificial intelligence, firstly produced via your AI services, and B, shared on your platform?
Thank you for the question. I think it is an immense responsibility that we feel as a company, that I feel, both, as you point out, building technology that enables people to create and share using AI, and also building platforms on which they can share. And so that's both a real opportunity, and I'm excited about the value that people get out of it, but also we do feel a real sense of responsibility for how that works. I'll talk just for a moment about how we approach that. When we're talking about building our models, I mentioned earlier that we do reports when the models are released, but what those reports entail is a significant amount of work before the models are released on what we call alignment. It's basically a process where we identify what's the ideal behavior of the model, and we work to ensure that the model is aligning to that behavior. So that can be safeguards around things like privacy and safety. It can also be behaviors that we want around non-discrimination, just as an example. And so a big part of the work that we do is both building diverse training sets to make sure that the models behave in a balanced and non-discriminatory way, that we do that work when we are building the models, that we're transparent about how the models are built and evaluated, but then once we ship them, that we're also doing work both in looking at how people are using the models and also looking at our platforms to understand how people are sharing and what kind of content they're generating. And so actually in that case, AI is a particularly useful tool for ensuring that we can spot harmful content on the platform, whether it's AI generated or not, and actually help us before things even get reported to us to take them down. So I think that we feel a lot of responsibility both on the building safe and responsible models and also on making sure that we have a safe and responsible community in terms of how people use our platforms. I do agree with what Ginny said earlier, that in addition to the role that we play, we also try to build capacity in people that deploy our AI models to make sure that they can deploy responsibly. So for example, we also open source technology that helps deployers of our models build these kinds of protections into their software as well.
I think you're saying to the committee that you do feel responsible. You do see yourself as responsible for the impacts and outputs of the artificial intelligence. That's what your answer is. Ms. Badanes.
Badanes.
Sorry. Thank you. Sorry.
Make it easier. So thank you so much for the question. We have a series of things that we call responsible AI principles. And I'll start by saying they are grounded first and foremost in our human rights principles as well. And so what we try to do is make sure that we don't just have nice principles that we put out into the place so that I can stand in front of you and say we care about responsible AI. The reality is it's critical for us to take them in and not have them abstract, but actually turn them into concrete obligations that go across the full AI lifecycle. And in fact, one of those AI principles is accountability. And it's saying that there are accountable people at the end of every decision, that we should not point just to technology, because we know that behind that are people and institutions, and they're the ones who really carry those obligations. And we take that responsibility as sort of an end-to-end approach. We look at things like how models are designed and trained, all the way through how the systems themselves are deployed, and of course, into how they're used in the real world, how people are actually interacting with these products. The reason that's important is because responsibility does not stop at launch. We don't just put a product out into the world and say, well, we did all our work, we're good now. We recognize that it requires ongoing monitoring, feedback channels. We need incident response, and we need to be flexible and nimble enough to make changes when things don't go the way that we had intended. And we need to have that responsibility ourselves so that we can course correct. I'd also say that we focus on the most salient human rights risks because there is a lot of risk out there to manage, and it is important that we start with what is most important. And so we did an independent assessment recently, a couple years ago, to help us identify what are the 5 priority, most salient human rights risks when it comes to AI, specifically as Microsoft. And we identified those as AI development around bias and hallucinations, risks from misuse of unsafe deployment, working conditions in the AI supply chain, environmental impacts, and then finally inclusion and access to AI. And so our approach focuses first with those as our most critical human rights risks, and we govern around those. And then finally, I'll just say that and I already sort of mentioned this, but we believe that responsibility follows meaningful control. So essentially, when you look at the different layers of the life cycle, you've got those developers, deployers, and platform providers. They all have roles to play. And so where Microsoft has control, for example, through system design, our own policies, our access controls, we put binding requirements on ourselves on those to ensure that we have, for example, things like heightened review for sensitive use cases or high impact uses, rather than relying just on the voluntary principles that we've put out there ourselves. And then just finally, I'll say that we don't believe that companies can do this alone. And so I just wanted to reinforce that we do support clear, proportionate regulation and international standards that will make this accountability possible.
Great, thank you. So just a quick follow-up. So you are both, I think, our witnesses are taking responsibility for the impact and outputs of AI. Can I ask just quickly to say, so those AI is evolving, those impacts are foreseeable, so may be foreseeable and may not be foreseeable on the long term. What responsibility what do you see as your responsibility for managing and responding to future and foreseeable harms to human rights? Just answer briefly, please.
Sure. I'll just quickly add on and say we do our best to identify what is around a corner, and a large part of that is working with external stakeholders. We don't believe that we contain all the information inside Microsoft to know what those next risks might be. So we have a variety of councils and consultants and people that we engage with, the communities that are impacted by AI, to ensure we're getting those signals back in so that we can anticipate and do our best with what might be coming next. And then, of course, we plan to have responses when we miss the mark.
You publish that, future risks?
Yes, we do. We have within our transparency reports.
Thank you very much.
At Meta, we have a corporate human rights policy that sets the company-wide standards under which we protect and uphold human rights. As a part of that overall human rights program, we have built what we call a Frontier AI framework, which is our policy for how we look as we're building novel models at what the risks are of those models, how we guard against them. And so we publish that on our website so you can see what the process is. But briefly, for both frontier models that we build and also any change that we make that involves AI, we have an internal risk process where we make decisions, where we evaluate the thing that we're proposing to change. We look at the risks, including human rights risks, of any proposed change, and we evaluate both the benefits of the change and the risks and adopt mitigations before that goes out. So that's a routine part of our process, and it's something that we take very seriously. It's become sort of foundational to how the company makes decisions about changes to our products.
Thank you very much indeed. We're going to have to move on to Dr. Peter Swallow now, and after that we'll hear from Lord Murray.
Ms. Badanes, one of the features of using AI, I'm sure you're aware of, is you see a lot of M dashes. And there's lots of different theories as to why this may be. Some have suggested that it's because of the information that's plugged into models to help create them. A lot of 17th and 18th and 19th century literature, and this is a form of bias, a bias for an American M dash over a good old British N dash. There is also, of course, a lot of, on a more serious note, concern about how bias may creep into AI models because of the nature of the evidence that they're being built around. Literature from an earlier period of time is not known for its modern way of looking at social issues. Lots of concern about other AI models spewing, very alarming, racist, offensive content based on what it's been trained on. How does your company mitigate and address unattended bias and discrimination in AI model training data? And how are you monitoring the outputs to ensure that bias is not there?
Sure. It is difficult to ever ensure that bias won't exist. We're humans, and it is inherently in all things that we do. We do, though, have an obligation to do our best to mitigate that bias and to have processes in place that will improve that situation. So we start by embedding it across the entire AI lifecycle. I'll start with the model development. Teams are required to assess the training data really carefully and then identify how representative it is. And if there are any gaps that might exist within the training data, looking for things like groups who might be underserved or misrepresented in that data, because it's not something we can just assume is not there. We have to actively test for it. We have to actively look for it. Because again, we ourselves are human and it's not something that will immediately be apparent to us. So we then apply something that we call systemic evaluation, which means that models and systems are tested, and we're using what's called disaggregated analysis, which is our way of saying essentially you can't just test one way, one time, and say this model's good. You have to have different contexts. You have to consider different groups. You have to have multiple different kinds of tests with those different lenses in order to get any kind of accuracy score that gives you any kind of confidence that the bias has been considered. And then just finally, I'll say it's not just at the model level, of course, because you can often see bias emerge through how the AI itself is deployed and used. And so that's where we bring in our higher risk or sensitive uses to subject those kinds of uses to additional human scrutiny to ensure that through an internal governance process that we haven't inadvertently introduced bias into a highly sensitive use case, and we have escalation processes around that as well. So there is no perfect solution to ending bias in these systems, and there's part of it is being cognizant of that and putting processes in place that can get us into the best place, so particularly those who are most underrepresented and vulnerable are represented in these models.
You're able to have that level of control even though Copilot is powered by other models?
It's an excellent question, because we do have, when we have our own models, of which we do have smaller models, we have more control, but we still run those that are presented within our systems through similar processes as well. And that goes to the deployment stage. So that's not the training side, that's not the development side, it is the deployment and then the platform side as well. So we uphold, even in those areas, the same principles.
Sherman, did you have anything to add on M-dashes or anything else?
I'm afraid that I am equally perplexed by the M- situation, so I can't assist the committee on that particular aspect. More broadly, though, on non-discrimination, it's obviously a critical priority from a human rights perspective. It's also a critical business priority, because if our models are biased, if they're behaving in ways that underserve some segments of the population versus others, or that don't fairly characterize certain views, that makes the products less useful to people. People are less willing to adopt them and choose our products. And so for both reasons, we spend quite a lot of time doing that. I agree with everything that Ginny said in terms of the training data being really critical, making sure that we have broadly representative training data that represents different views, different subsegments of the population, all of those things, having technical evaluations to make sure that we're guarding against it. The one other thing that I would add is the use of both human and automated red teaming. One of the things that we really try to do in looking at how the models can be used, and also because bias changes in society over time, the way that people may prompt our AI may change over time. And so looking at both adversarial testing, where we hire people specifically to go and look at whether the model is giving biased answers in some way, but then also looking at how people are using in production online, and if we see problems coming out. So we can both score those things quantitatively, but also look at them qualitatively to understand if the model is aligning with what we want.
What would you say are the core risks to human rights posed by AI?
I think it's a topic of much debate, as I'm sure in this inquiry you've heard a lot of different topics. The ones that I think most about are non-discrimination, which we've just talked about, also the right of privacy, the right of free expression. I think those are often top of mind when we think about human rights and AI, but there's also a whole lot of others. Keeping people safe is obviously a fundamental priority. So I don't think I could identify one or a small set of human rights priorities, but I know that's a big topic of discussion.
You don't specifically reference their risks to democracy and the democratic process.
We certainly do think about that, yes.
Are you content? Are you satisfied that Meta is currently doing enough to challenge the use of AI by foreign actors on social media, where there have been concerns raised about how AI and social media more broadly are being used to undermine democratic rights and freedoms?
I would certainly never suggest that the work to do that is done, in part because some of the people that are trying to engage in those kinds of attacks are adversarial, and they continue to evolve their tactics, they continue to behave adversarially. And so we have dedicated teams at our company who really focus on this issue specifically. That involves a number of different efforts, one of which I alluded to this earlier, but just to come back to it, is the role of AI in actually helping us to identify and combat, for example, coordinated inauthentic behavior on the platform. So if people are trying to use our platforms to spread disinformation, we've actually been quite successful in using AI to detect those kinds of activities and deter them. We actually have just we published a transparency report on that activity as well. Happy to share it with you if it's useful. But broadly,
specifically in that, because this is something I wanted to raise.
Of course.
Obviously, there is a huge role for Meta to spot some of these activities. I think also it's fair to say that individuals need to get better at being able to spot it. In recent, and I think as politicians, we see this in our day-to-day interactions on social media. In recent months, there have been an increase in the number of groups on Facebook where anonymous posting is becoming increasingly the main way of posting into those groups. Anonymous posting means that it is impossible for an individual who sees a post to be able to do any kind of due diligence into the person or bot posting it. Are you comfortable, are you content that this change in the way that people are using your social media platform is allowing them to safely interact, free from bots, free from AI, free from foreign influence, using these tools to undermine our democracy?
It's an important question, and you asked earlier about how different human rights play into our calculus. One of the things that we thought a lot about, and as you'll know, by default, Facebook is a real identity platform. You identify yourself.
It's not by default, is it? Because in all of these groups, you have people posting as anonymous users, and there is no way of qualifying for an individual who is responding to those posts, seeing those posts, whether the person at the other side of it is their neighbour from across the road, or is somebody in Russia, or is from a bot farm in anywhere around the world.
Well, the design of the service is when you create your account in the first instance. When I create my account, I have to say that I'm Rob Sherman, and our policies say that you have to identify yourself by your real name. One of the things that we also wanted to do, recognizing that people use Facebook groups for lots of different purposes, some of which are sensitive. For example, getting support for emotional challenges that they're facing in their lives, health conditions, those sorts of things. We wanted to give people the space to be able to engage in those communities without putting their real name attached to it. And so in some specific groups where the group administrator has enabled this, we allow people the option of being anonymous within the group. Now, it's important to note that in those cases, those people are not anonymous to us, meaning that they are still posting under their real name account. We have their identity and have access to the information. So to the extent that there's criminal behavior, things like that, we can work with law enforcement. And in addition, we have some of the measures that I talked about to guard against inauthentic accounts, bot farms, things like that. And we've been pretty successful. I would not say 100% successful in addressing that problem. I do think that you pointed out, I think a thing that is important, regardless of whether we're talking about anonymous speech on Facebook or whether it's anonymous speech anywhere on the internet, I do think, and I would encourage, and I think the company would encourage people to be thoughtful about the sources of the information that they consume. And so if you're getting information that comes from somebody anonymous in a health support group, for example, that may be a really positive source of emotional support for you. I wouldn't, for example, conclude that that person has medical expertise. And so making sure that we are clear with people about what level of confidence they can have in who's talking to them, I think is another important piece of this.
I'd suggest there's work to do. Ms. Badanes, just very quickly, because I think that the final question is important to be asked. How would the development and implementation of universal rules for AI risk management impact human rights?
It's hard to know exactly how those are going to be actually laid out. I would say that it is important, though, for there to be some coherence across multiple jurisdictions. It's challenging for both the technology companies to comply, but also for the actual desired impact of those rules to be effective if they're fragmented across jurisdictions. So I would essentially say I am hopeful that we will get to a place where there's more coherence and that the application of universal rights could be a platform for that.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Sherman, in answer to Dr. Swallow, you said you had some more information that you could share with the committee. I think we'd be very pleased to see more of that policy background.
Absolutely. Happy to do so.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm always the enemy of the committee because I'm always looking at the clock and my colleagues know that I have to try and move us along. We're going to hear from Lord Murray of Blidworth in a moment, and then after that from Baroness Chakrabarty.
Yes, so we're going to move on now to discuss accountability and AI. I've got to put to you some easy questions, and then Lady Chakrabarty is going to put the hard questions. So the easy question is this. If I ask a large language model a question, will it tell me the truth? Mr. Sherman.
Well, it's certainly designed to tell you the truth. I talked earlier about the alignment process, and one part of that is teaching the models to give factual information wherever they can, and also to be transparent if they lack confidence in an answer. So there are some things that are not fully knowable. I certainly would not say that AI is always going to give a 100% accurate answer. There's a challenge that exists for our models and for all models in the industry called hallucination, where models can give incorrect information. And so that's why, among other things, it's important, as I just talked about with your colleague, to be thoughtful about the sources of information. It's also why when our AI gives responses, it cites to sources so that if you want to know where a particular piece of information came from, you can do additional research.
As between yes, no, and maybe, you said maybe.
So the goal is for it to be factual and to be clear when it doesn't have confidence, but that's not always consistently something that the model does.
Thank you. Ms. Badanes, what do you say to that question?
I mean, I think it's incredibly difficult to ask a large language model to consistently provide you with the truth, in part because of some of the just sort of inherent flaws of the way the systems are designed. I do expect they will continue to get better, but also because truth is at times subjective and it is a challenging environment to guarantee or ensure anything. All that being said, I think it's really important to focus on how do we use these models? What are we using them for? And what are our obligations as technology companies to both educate and to work on things like media and AI literacy around these, but as well as to make it clear what the purpose of a model is. This is where model cards and system cards are really effective tools for transparency. If you were going to a model and the purpose of, or a system, and your purpose is to write a fan fiction novel, then it's maybe not the place where you're going to necessarily expect the most truthful answer. Whereas if you're going to a system and the purpose of it is to get the latest on the news of the day, then that's an environment where you have a higher expectation to get truthful information. And in that case, you would expect things like citations that link back to real articles that have real accurate news reporting and information. So I do think we all have a lot of work to do in this space. Part of it is the expectations of what these systems should provide, and part of it is making sure we're working on things like media and AI literacy for those who are consuming it on the other side of the screen.
So as far as trying to generate trust in the answers given by LLMs, you both point to extensive citation by the machine to indicate where the sources have come from. Are there any other steps which you would suggest that could be taken to encourage trust in a way that is obvious to the user of the LLM?
Well, I would suggest two things. The first is, as we talked about earlier, making sure people understand when they're interacting with an AI, and also they're understanding the context in which the AI is operating. That's something that we try to tell people and give people information, for example, about the fact that AI may not always be accurate, and just educating people about that is important. The other piece, which is less for individuals, but I think is an important accountability mechanism for society, is the technical evaluations that I alluded to earlier. Among the technical evaluations that we run, there are some industry standard ones that look at helpfulness and accuracy and alignment of the model's responses with factual information. And so you don't have to simply rely on us saying that our models are reliable, although we hope they are. But one of the things that independent people can do is they can compare our models with other companies' models to see how well they stack up around this. And again, nothing is 100%, but it's certainly a goal. And I think the fact that there's data published around it is a helpful accountability measure.
Perhaps, would it be possible for the model to generate, together with its answer, an assessment of the likelihood of the reliability of the answer it's given?
We do try to do that. So again, with the caution that nothing is perfect, one of the instructions that we give our model is when it doesn't have confidence, when somebody asks a yes/no question or a factual question and it's not sure of the answer, it can qualify and give a sense of the extent to which it thinks that answer is right, or it can say, based on this factor, it's probably this answer. Similarly, one of the things that you can do, and that I actually do quite frequently when I use our AI, but other companies' AI as well, is ask the AI specifically to respond with a percentage confidence in the answer. And AIs are pretty good at understanding what their level of confidence is. So if you simply just ask, you can get a pretty good sense of that.
Thank you. I'll have to try that. Ms. Badanes, have you got anything to add to that particular answer?
No, I agree with what was said there. I would say one area we've seen that trust is lost is when the system does not answer a question. And so one thing that we have seen as successful is when the answers are complicated, giving various context around why. And I think that does build trust, essentially not just saying we can't be 100% sure on this one, but also sort of providing almost the other approach where other people might differ on the answer here, and then sources for that as well, and allowing people to go to those original sources and investigate more thoroughly themselves.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's turn to Baroness Chakrabarty, and then I have a question for you about age restrictions.
So given the answer that nothing is perfect, if an individual relies on incorrect, fabricated, or even manipulative outputs from models and suffer human rights harms as a result, for example, I don't know, incorrect legal advice or worse, or find themselves in a suicidal position that they've been encouraged towards, who should be held responsible and who can be held responsible?
I'm happy to go first.
Okay.
So I've mentioned before, we feel like, first of all, accountability is a critical component. It's one of our AI principles, responsible AI principles, and we think that it should be attached to where there's meaningful control. And so in hypothetical situations, it's difficult to say where the responsibility lies, but if you get into specific examples, you'll understand, was the mistake that essentially led to this, was it at the actual model level? Was it at the deployment level? Was it where it was ended up on a platform somewhere? Or was it a manipulative and malicious user on the other end of it? Good example of that is, we know that AI is being used to defraud people in a lot of different ways. Fraud is nothing new. AI is supercharging it, making translation easier, making access to personal information, and therefore using it to create better phishing tactics, more effective. In that case, we would ultimately say the actor who manipulated and used that information should be held responsible. Does not mean, though, that those who are on the product side shouldn't identify gaps where that may have been too easy for them to access and make improvements there. So it can be a shared responsibility, and in some cases it's very clear.
Mr. Sherman.
I think, as I talked about earlier, making sure that our models are safe and responsible is an important, critical priority. It's something that I spend the majority of my time on. And so, among other things, that means making sure that, if somebody expresses intent to harm themselves, that was the example that you gave, that we're giving thoughtful, safe, research-backed responses to that and referring people to human experts who can help support them. And I think that's important, that the AI not step out of its lane, so to speak, when it comes to that. Similarly, for something like legal advice, we would not want people to rely on an AI model as their lawyer, and so similarly would want the AI to give people information if they're asking for information, but also encourage them to
So
seek
that's
legal advice.
your approach. You're both describing a best practice approach, but to return to the fundamental question, where the model is giving bad legal advice or is supposedly giving some kind of emotional support but ends up manipulating somebody, who should be held responsible?
I think I wouldn't feel comfortable expressing a view on what the right legal framework is. I think that's, that is a hard challenge for Parliament, and I am glad that is not my job to decide. But I do agree with what Ms. Badanes said earlier, that there are different players in a particular fact pattern, and a court would need to look at the relative liability of different people who was in the best position to guard against that. And in most cases, I would imagine there are multiple players there.
Okay, that's interesting. So that's multiple players at the corporate end. But my next question is about multiple players at the regulatory end. And I think this was sort of touched on a little bit earlier, that you're huge global corporations, you're operating all over the world, and of course there are different rules in different jurisdictions. So I wonder how workable that is from your perspective, and how you deal with it. So, for example, do you end up complying with the more onerous rules, and because you've got a global product, effectively complying with the more onerous rules, even in jurisdictions where they don't apply? So, for example, the EU AI Act is one of the more robust approaches. If you're complying with that, do you end up complying with that all over the world?
Sure. So there are a couple of pieces to the answer to that. The first is, obviously we operate in most countries around the world, and we have a responsibility to our community in each of those countries. And our human rights policy particularly applies globally. It is a single policy for the company. What that means is that some of the programs and processes that I talked about, including doing risk assessments before we make product changes and those things, those apply globally. We also have what we call a regulatory readiness process, which is a comprehensive process for the company to look at new legal obligations that are introduced in different countries around the world. And so the approach tends to be that we try to take a thoughtful and responsible approach to everyone globally, but also recognize that different countries are going to have different obligations. Just to give you one example, here in the UK, the UK GDPR gives people a right to get access to information that we hold about them. That's not the law everywhere, but because we did it to comply with the law here in the UK and some other jurisdictions, we actually extended tools to give people that access globally because we thought it was a responsible and good thing to do. There are other kinds of requirements. So for example, you mentioned EU. So the EU GDPR has different disclosure requirements than that don't apply to British citizens. And so it wouldn't make sense for us to apply the sort of formalities of the EU GDPR to people here in the UK. And so what that means in practice is we generally try to take a broadly responsible and safe approach globally, but then also recognize we have specific obligations in different places. The last thing I'll say is obviously the details matter quite a lot. We've talked about different roles that a company like Meta or like Microsoft plays. And so sometimes we are building an AI model, sometimes we are running a service like Instagram. There are lots of different things in between. And so dealing with regional complexity is easier in some places than others. So for example, we're not building a separate AI model for the UK and a separate AI model for France and a separate AI model for the US. And so we do need to take a consistent global approach to doing that. And so the specifics do matter, and it makes our lives easier if there's consistency across borders, but we also have a process to deal with the fact that different countries have different expectations.
Ms. Badanes?
I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I would say right now we're not looking at a lack of activity in the AI governance space. I would say the bigger challenge we're seeing is fragmentation. And certainly the fragmentation is complicated for technology companies, but the reality is we're big companies, we will figure it out. I have concerns about creating actual risk. Essentially, I worry that at times when we have these variety of approaches that we're not actually addressing the broader safety or human rights risks that are actually at the center of what everyone is trying collectively to solve. And there's just a reality that all of this stuff is crossing borders. I mean, essentially, that's the reality of what's trying to be governed here. Everything about advanced AI is transnational by design. The systems are developed and tested and deployed in a variety of places across borders and within multiple supply chains, and then integrated into products that are used at a global scale. And so this is a global challenge that I understand people are trying to regionally approach. So a couple thoughts I mentioned before, the more that we can align ourselves to international standards and norms and have is essentially like a base layer of agreement, whether that's the Hiroshima approach, which we have mirrored a lot of our work around as well. That's a strong place to kind of get us all out of these fragmented models and into a place of agreement for foundations and then build from there.
I'm getting a sense that you would actually welcome greater harmonization at the global level in terms of regulatory standards.
I absolutely. We would like to have some cohesion or some coherence across the different regions. That would be welcomed from just an ease of use perspective, certainly as a technology company, but also I think to have more impact of what we're trying to achieve.
One thing I would just add is that the chair in his introduction mentioned that Minister Narayan was just at the India AI Summit this past week. I was there as well. And one of the goals of those summits is for governments to come together to talk about some of these challenges and to talk about the approach. You know, year over year, we've had 4 of these. The first one was here in the UK. Year over year, the technology is vastly different each time. And so giving governments an opportunity to talk certainly to us, but also to each other to make sure that there's consistency in the way that they're approaching it, that they're sharing information, and that we're working together as a community, I think is a really critical piece. It's a little bit different than your question around legislation, but I think it's a really important area and probably one that we could do as a global community to make more investment in. The technology is moving so quickly that this kind of informal collaboration is going to be really critical.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in fact, I'd like to build on that question before I turn to my colleague Lord Rook for the following question, but I'd like to ask you specifically about how you are collaborating with others within the world. And I've got in mind particularly Google here, on the issue of age restriction and the kind of parental controls that they themselves seem to be breaking by saying that they would allow the turning off by young people of parental controls. We followed that up as a committee when we had Google before us, and I want to say on the record I'm extremely grateful to them for the long statement that they have now sent us answering the questions we raised. But let me put a couple of the points that they've made to you to see whether you're taking the same approach. They say that we're continuously evolving our products to provide age-appropriate experience and enhance parental controls. And they admit that there needs to be a change in this idea that you might enable children to turn off parental controls. They say under our planned policy update, any supervised minor will have to get parental approval before they can turn off supervision. And they say our focus remains on empowering families with the tools they need to navigate the digital world safely. And elsewhere in this long statement, they say this year we begin testing a machine learning-based age estimation model in the US, and we believe actors across the digital ecosystem, i.e. Microsoft and Meta and others, have a role to play in ensuring age-appropriate online experiences. So if I may, let me ask you that one way to protect children from adverse outcomes might be for their fundamental human rights to be protected by age controls across products and services that use AI. So in what circumstances should AI systems and products be subject to age restrictions? And are you also, along with Google, looking at ways in which that can be managed? Mr. Sherman, should we start with you?
Thank you, Chair. This is a really critical area of focus. It's something that's essential to us as a company. Making sure that young people are safe on our platforms is really critical. I should also say that I'm myself a parent. I have an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old at home, and so I'm sort of in the age range where these kinds of questions are particularly salient for our family, and we have lots of conversations about them. So I think about this a lot. Absolutely, this is a thing that companies like Meta, you mentioned Google, Microsoft, I'm sure would include themselves in this, have a responsibility to do work around this. And so we have taken a number of steps to help keep young people safe on our services, including within our AI. And I should say that a lot of this actually has been informed by the work that's been done here in the UK. Obviously the Online Safety Act, but before that, the Age Appropriate Design Code was very influential in our thinking about how to build multi-layered protections for youth online. So for example, we rolled out teen accounts on Instagram. So if you sign up for an account on Instagram and you say that you're 16, by default, you will start with a more restrictive experience. If you're an adult, your account
How do you verify that?
So I think we have a number of measures in place to do that. The first is obviously we ask. We also use, you mentioned the use of machine learning. This is something we've been doing for several years at this point, using machine learning models to predict if somebody is likely not telling us the truth about their age, so we can use those additional signals. The challenge that we face, and candidly that I face as a parent, is each app is doing that individually. And so I think it's certainly a responsibility of a company like Meta to make sure that we build age-appropriate experiences into our app, that the teen accounts that has a more private, more restrictive experience is a really critical example of that. We also have a responsibility to build parental controls so that parents can make the choices that are right for them. But I think this point that you're raising about how we validate age is a really challenging one, and it's an area where...
Sorry to interrupt, but is it true that even things like library cards are used as a form of verification? Because that doesn't seem very robust to me.
Well, I think we have a number of different methods that we can use for age verification. Typically, we do use birth certificates or government identification. We also have some AI-based validation methods that we can use. But I think one of the core challenges in the industry, which is not a Meta-specific challenge, is as a parent, I have to go from app to app and do different verification methods in various places. Some of them are more reliable than others. Some of them require me to give my credit card. Some of them require me to give my personal information, or my child to give her personal information. And it's just inconsistent. And I think both for me as a parent and also for us as a company, having that done at the platform level, where if it's an app on Android or if it's an app on iOS, then that would be done once at the platform level, and then we would just be told this user is 16 or this user's over 18 or whatever it is, and then everybody would build the appropriate experiences based on that. And I think that's not something that exists in the ecosystem now, but that I think would be valuable.
Okay, that sounds as though we want to explore that a little bit further. Perhaps, Ms. Badanes, can you build on that for us?
Sure. Well, I mean, this is foundationally important when we talk about human rights to talk about the most vulnerable and the highest risk communities. And I'm not sure you can get much higher risk than children and youth. And so it's critically important. The other thing to note, though, of course, is with AI, you're just going to have a variety of different experiences. There are lots of different programs. This is sort of getting to the previous point. Their experiences are going to vary wildly depending on the system that they're using and the context of which they're using it in the first place. So I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it is why we talk about the risk-based approach rather than trying to apply something like a single age threshold across all AI tools, because we think that we have stronger safeguards to apply where the risks to the children are higher. I think there are higher risks in certain scenarios than in others. So for example, a chatbot where they're, forming relationships is going to be a higher risk scenario than potentially a tutoring app. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be restrictions and mechanisms around the tutoring app, but you do need to take the context into consideration because some are higher stakes and more sensitive than others. And then I would say from an operational perspective, it's not just about restricting access. We also need to build these age-appropriate design and safety guardrails. Again, I think I'm just echoing what was said previously, creating clear boundaries into the system from the very beginning. So I don't know that I have much more to build on than that. I think it is obviously a complicated situation, but if we start with a high-risk user and then high-risk scenario and work from there, I think we'll find that we have some effective strategies.
To help the committee, though, can you tell us what kind of products that you have that do have age restrictions on them? And are there any negative aspects for human rights about imposing such restrictions?
We, of course, have Xbox, which is a gaming platform where you do have a lot of younger people. Going back to the point of having children, you can maybe see from behind me, I have 3 boys and they game, they use Xbox. And so this is something that is important to us as well, though it's important regardless of if I have children or not, but I just do experience it firsthand. So yeah, we do have age verification measures within Xbox in large part in response to the Online Safety Act. Where kids are directed to age appropriate experiences based on the age that they have validated when they went into the product. And you asked about trade-offs, sorry. There have been trade-offs that we've seen so far. I think we're still gathering our key lessons. It's an area where I'm not as directly connected with our digital safety or Xbox team, so that's something I'm happy to sort of give you some lessons learned back in writing if that's helpful, because I do know that we have experienced that it can create some friction to the point of both from the parents and the kids. And of course, we want to value their experience, but we also want to make sure that the kids are safe. So I do think we have some lessons learned in that area.
I think we would be very interested to see more on that if you could share it with us. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to go now, if I may, to my colleague Lord Rook.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Badanes, particularly glad to ask someone from Microsoft some questions. We had a general election here in 2024, and a few hours later I found myself on a plane to Hiroshima for a meeting convened by the Vatican about the ethics of AI. And I got to sit next to your president, Brad Smith, for the day. And I thought I'm going to ask him lots of really intelligent questions, but soon found out that the combined effects of jet lag and election lag had turned my brain to jelly. So I'm going to ask you the question that I probably should have asked him, which is, should there be an opt-out for individuals who do not wish to be subject to AI in the services, products, technology they use? And if there should, how are you progressing that? And if not, why not?
I think this is an area that there is going to be additional exploration and there's a lot of opportunity here, which means essentially it is not perfect yet. But I would say that the best place to start is at the specific user and feature levels. And there are a lot of those features currently available where you can opt out. It is hard at this moment to know from a data perspective and every single thing that you do where you can opt in and out. It's something I would love for us to explore with you all as you have thoughts on it. But there are some good practical ways that you can opt out of engagement. There are also ways that we've seen from an opt-out perspective, and I recognize this is a little different than your question, but I just want to address it, which is around the use of data, for example, from organizations. There are features where a website can choose to opt out of having their content made available for training of models, that kind of thing. So there is progression in the space of opting in and out, but I'll be completely honest, I think it is an opportunity for additional growth.
And just following up, Mr. Sherman, interested in your thoughts on that. Are we at the point whereby AI is so embedded in some of these systems that it would be impossible to opt out because it's just part of the kind of the mesh of how different technologies that we're using work?
When you look at services like Facebook and Instagram, AI has been a part of them for, since the beginning, pretty much. I've been at the company for 14 years, and AI has been a part, at least as long as I've been there. And we talked earlier about some of the ways in terms of choosing what you see in your news feed, or helping to deal with spam and do spam filtering. There's a wide range of ways that AI is used. So I don't think it would be real. And I should say also, if you project forward a couple of years, I think that's going to be even more true in more segments of the population. Like, AI will be embedded in technology in the way that internet is embedded in a lot of our lives today. And so I don't think that opting out of AI as a technology is probably realistic. I do, though, think that it's really important for people to have control over what experiences they have and how they engage with technology, which is why, for example, you may choose that you don't want to use Meta AI or a chatbot when you use our services. You can still browse Instagram, and you can still engage with the people that you're friends with, and do all of that, and then just not choose to use that part of the service. So I certainly think that that's available, but I would caution against an idea that we can sort of wall off AI from the rest of technology.
So moving to a slightly more apocalyptic zone, in 2023, a statement from the Centre for AI Safety, signed by many leaders in the tech industry, warned of possible risks of extinction from AI. I'm interested to know how you're managing existential risks to human rights, such as human extinction, for instance. And if not foundation, I know, just as a starter, then you can develop this from there. And if not foundation model developers, who should be responsible for addressing some of those really serious risks that this powerful technology could create?
Well, it's certainly a discussion that we have in our company and the industry, and it's a discussion in the AI space more broadly. One thing that I should say before getting to the specifics of your question is we often, my company does this, other companies often talk about superintelligence or AGI or some of these big terms as though they're a binary, right? That, today we wake up and there's no AGI, and tomorrow we wake up and there is AGI, and things have vastly changed. I think the reality is maybe a little bit less exciting and a little bit more mundane, which is that the technology will continue to iteratively improve, day over day, week over week. Along with that, the possibility and the opportunity of the technology will increase. The risks also will increase, and our ability to use technology to guard against those risks will all increase. And so I don't think we're in a situation where we're going to wake up one day and the world is vastly different. I do think that there's time to look at technology and evaluate it, to make sure that we understand what the risks are as things are being developed and as they're deployed, and to build safeguards. So in general, I think that's important. I will say that I think that for us or any foundation model developer, thinking about the full range of risks is really important. We have teams at our company who literally just think about this. And so we've published, I think I referred to it earlier, but our Frontier AI framework, which talks about the program that we have in place to evaluate models before they're put into the world for things like chemical and biological weapons risk or cybersecurity risk or these kinds of things. And so it's an important part of our process both before and after we ship models to look at those things. In addition to us doing that, we are working with governments, we're working with experts in the private sector that we hire to help advise us on these things, and so that's really critical. The two things I would leave you with, one, I think this is an ongoing, I referred earlier to another kind of adversarial threat. I think this is a thing that we need to continue to work with governments on. Governments have intelligence that we don't always have, and so making sure that we're collaborating, that's an important priority. But in addition to this, I would also just say, I worry sometimes, while the risks that you're talking about obviously are extreme, they're also remote. And so when I think about where I spend my time or where companies like mine should spend their time, that they need to think about those risks, but they also need to think about some of the more here and now risks that we've talked about earlier today. And so I think we feel a responsibility to think across that spectrum.
That's really helpful. Ms. Badanes, are there areas where Microsoft is concerned or working around the potential for existential risks from AI and how you combat those and put safeguards in place?
Right. Well, this is a primary key example of where these sort of international gatherings and frameworks are so critical and important, and they bring multiple stakeholders together. And while this may be a low probability example, it is still extremely high risk, as I think we've all acknowledged. So that's why the Seoul AI Summit that brought together a framework around how we would respond to this sort of existential risk statement was so critical. And really a lot of what was just said by my colleague at Meta is what I would say too. And that's in large part because I think we're all building from that same framework. So we also put together a frontier governance framework, is what we call ours, where we look over the risks that are coming from chemical and biological risks, cyber operations, advanced autonomy, loss of human control. These are sort of the categories that were identified as the most existential risks. And we've also put together our own testing, red teaming efforts around what those would look like. But that's really similar to what you're hearing from others in industry, which is, I think, a promising approach that says that we're all adhering to this international framework that that included expertise from a lot of different areas. And then we are also, as part of that, not requirement necessarily, but as part of that commitment, we are also engaging with independent experts, people outside of our company, people of expertise in these areas, to ensure that we're informing the way that we're approaching our own governance framework. So I think that's a really, more than anything, it's a strong endorsement for why we see value in creating these broader frameworks that we can all align to and then execute, of course, independently relative to our own products and services.
Thank you.
Before we go to Sir Desmond Swain for the final question, I just want to go a little bit further on what Lord Rooke has just asked you about. And I mentioned Geoffrey Hinton's remarks at the beginning of our proceedings. He is the godfather of AI, after all, and it was he who coined the phrase about existential risk. But some of us have also read as a cheery thought over the Christmas period the book, If Anybody Builds It, We All Die. Now, we're not apocalyptic here, but we are here to defend the human rights and the safety of our citizens and to recognise that there may be real threats. And when we see people leaving the industry, including people from your own companies and those associated with others I've mentioned in the course of the proceedings, when you see them leaving because of their concerns that AI represents, and because we're well aware of the malign actors in the world who don't maybe share the ethics that you have been expressing here today, what more can we do to ensure that there is a robust international architecture to defend us as best we can from what are the potential threats that others have identified? Ms. Badanes, would you want to go first?
Sure. Well, it's never ideal when someone leaves a company where they feel like for some reason they weren't able to be heard in that environment. So while this is a very small thing, one thing that we've implemented and put into place because of this concern is we actually have put together a very specific, it's a simple tool where employees can go and if they would like to express concern about the way our products are being either built or implemented or even used by our own customers, where they believe that it goes against any of our human rights commitments or our responsible AI principles, they can do that and they can present evidence and information they have. This is again a small tactical thing, but it is important that we make sure we do not close out dissenting opinions within the companies, because as we are building these technologies, it is critical that we identify where the concerns are coming from. And if people feel like they're not being heard at the company and they have to go externally in order to do that, that's not ideal. As far as ways that we can improve on it, look, I'd say that there are a lot of really complicated challenges that we, and I say we as a large society, have been able to resolve that have had similar roots. So I would look at how we address nuclear challenges initially. I'd look at maybe less existential risk, but still clearly complicated challenges like airplanes. How have we ensured that an airplane can take off in one country, fly over to 5 others, and land in another country, all committed to similar standards and agreements of safety and what that looks like from an interoperability perspective. So I do think we have frameworks we can build on. I don't think we're starting completely from scratch. This is not the first time we as society have addressed these existential risks. But of course, there are going to be new components that we need to incorporate into them.
That certainly gives us a more optimistic view and rather more realistic one as well. So, Mr. Sherman, do you want to quickly add to that? And then we go to Sir Desmond.
Thank you, sir. So obviously can't speak to why individual people left other companies. What I will say is, one of the other godfathers, or 3 godfathers of AI, Jan LeCun, who until recently was our chief AI scientist, is also one of those. He recently left the company, not to leave the industry because of concerns, but actually to go and build a startup focused on a different kind of AI development. But one of the things that he's said is that actually the concerns that you alluded to from some of his colleagues that are not going to come from the current generation of models at all. And again, I would defer to, I am not one of the godfathers of AI, but I think what Jan would say is that actually the current generation is relatively nascent relative to where we are going and the kind of technology. And so, I think he would say that this is not the thing that he is most worried about right now. That said, you asked a question of what more can we do, and I think there's a really critical answer there, which is I alluded earlier to the UK AI Security Institute, which I think is a leading voice in the global debate on these issues and is really sort of the thought leader globally when it comes to this. What they have been focused on is technical evaluations. How do we not only identify the kinds of risks that we would be worried about, but actually build technical measures where we can look at a particular model and see whether it presents the kinds of risks that we're talking about, and if so, take action to mitigate those risks or withdraw the model or whatever the case is. And one of the things that they've started doing through a network of safety and security institutes globally is collaborating on doing these evaluations. So for example, this past year, the UK AC, along with some of its colleagues in other countries, used our Llama open source model as a test in addition to some other models for cross-country collaboration on testing. And they were able to build a methodology where governments could collaborate with each other to do the kind of risk evaluation that we're talking about. I think that's a really important area to build on.
Thank you very much indeed. Sir Desmond.
Imagine that you are in the shoes of the chairman of this committee, Lord Alton. What would be the two most important recommendations that you would want to see in our report?
I can start. I appreciate, first of all, the work of Lord Alton, but the broader committee. This is, as I said in my introduction, a really critical area of focus, and I'm just grateful that the committee is spending time on it. Two suggestions. One, actually building on the point that I just made about the safety and security institutes globally. I think there's a real opportunity when we think about, when we think about the kinds of risks that we're talking about here, to build consensus across governments and with companies on the technical solutions, and either to evaluate whether risks exist or to mitigate those risks when they exist. And I think there's a real opportunity to invest not only in identifying those risks, but actually in building technology, because I think that will help companies like ours to align our approach to global expectations around human rights, safety, and other considerations. So that's one. The second one, going to the bias question that your colleague asked earlier, I alluded to this, but I think it's a really important point that often gets overlooked. AI models are trained on a large volume of data, and inherently they know what they're trained on. And so one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about is how to make sure our data sets are broad and broadly representative, so that they can serve not just the majority in a community, but they can serve all of the different parts of a community. That's something that's partially our responsibility, primarily our responsibility. But I think in thinking about the equities that the committee identifies and where public policy can also go, I would encourage you to think about how to encourage that.
Oh, thank you. And what would you like to add, if anything?
Yeah, one is a bit high-minded and not too different from what you just heard, and then the second is a bit more tactical. So this is going to sound like a broken record again, but I would encourage you all to adopt interoperable risk-based obligations for high impact and high capability AI systems. And then the second one, which is a bit more tactical, is focus on content provenance. And I know we talked about this earlier, but I'll come back to it and say, I think that when we are able to embed content provenance and watermarking and AI labeling experiences, we will, once we all start doing this in a more collective way, we'll really have an almost immediate impact for end users who are trying to make sense of what they're engaging with online in a world that right now is quite confusing to them. So I think that's one fairly easy and if done collaboratively way that we can start to have impact for real world people.
Well, Ms. Badanes and also Mr. Sherman, thank you very much indeed on behalf of the Joint Committee on Human Rights for giving us such an interesting and lively set of answers to the complex questions which colleagues have posed. Our clerks may be in touch with you afterwards, because this is always the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one. We've told you that, and Sir Desmond has just mentioned, that we will be now in the throes of writing our heads of report and then a full report once we've met the Minister, who comes in next after we conclude this part of the session. And we'd be always pleased to hear from you if there's more that you feel you'd like to say that we didn't cover sufficiently, or some things that were maybe perhaps off-piste, but nevertheless ought to have been on-piste, and that you would like to include in the evidence that you've given us. So don't see this as the end of the conversation, see it as, I say, the beginning. And Dame Chi mentioned to you also that her own committee will also be looking further, as other parliamentary committees across the House are. But for now, thank you very much indeed for giving us your time, your expertise, your knowledge. It's been greatly appreciated. I bring this part of the proceedings to an end. Order. Order. Welcome back to the Joint Committee on Human Rights and the session that we're holding today on artificial intelligence and human rights. We've heard already this afternoon from two of the big players, the corporations involved in this. We were listening to Microsoft and to Meta. We've previously heard from Google. And now we come really to the ultimate part of our oral sessions, and that's to hear the Minister, Kanishka Narayan, who's Minister for AI in the Department of Science and Technology and Innovation. He was appointed as Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the department on the 7th of September 2025 and was elected as Member of Parliament for Vale of Glamorgan in July 2024. Minister, we know that also you've recently been in India, in New Delhi, at the conference that was being held there. It was referred to in our earlier session. So we know that you're probably a bit jet lagged, and for that reason alone we're very grateful to you for spending time and coming here today to answer our questions. You know many of my colleagues from around the table. We have 6 members from the Commons, 6 members from the Lords, and as the name implies, we are a committee whose mandate is to look at human rights where it's written into the DNA of each and every department. And especially when sometimes departments themselves feel that their only preoccupation should be with the subject matter that they're dealing with. So we occasionally have to say to them that they have other responsibilities too. And I think you know probably what I'm driving at in that remark, and I know that one or two of my colleagues will explore it further in terms of how we ensure that there is cross-departmental interest in human rights questions. So if I may, if I can just ask a curtain-raising question before we turn first of all to my colleague Baroness Chakrabarti, who's going to ask you about upstreaming risk and pre-deployment testing. But I'd like, if I may, to just ask a general question about the government's approach to AI regulation. We heard a lot about the AI Opportunities Action Plan in earlier evidence to the committee. It's been criticised for prioritising innovation at the cost of effective regulation. I just wonder whether you agree that the desire for innovation shouldn't come at the cost of human rights protections, and whether you agree that strong guardrails in AI systems can prevent harm and promote public trust, and that without that public trust, the benefits of artificial intelligence for the whole of the community would not be properly realised. Minister, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you also for your both generous welcome and empathy with my jet lag. The enthusiasm to be here to talk to you has carried me through the last 48 hours or so, and really it's because the question of assessment ahead of the committee is very much, and the question that you ask is very much the priority for me and the government, which is to make sure that, yes, of course, the United Kingdom is at the frontier of capturing the opportunity of AI, but to do so in the obvious recognition that we only do so if people adopt it with trust, and we're able to make sure that we carry the entire country with us in that path. I've just been in India, as you said, and the central question there was how we treat the question of adoption and innovation in sync with the question of trust and security and safety. And too often, I think we think of these as involving trade-offs. I'm much more interested in finding the very significant overlaps in those two pursuits as well. And so in that spirit, what we have been focused on in government has been both understanding the building blocks of trust. 1, capability in the public sector, not least through the AI Security Institute. 2, having built that capability, being very quick to make sure that where things are going wrong, we're able to move quickly in regulating, and I'm happy to talk about some of the aspects of online safety in that context. But 3, alongside that, to recognise that static forms of regulation where we've been historically may not be best adapted to where we are likely to go. And that's why we have moved very promptly in some initiatives, not least through the Regulatory Innovation Office, as well as the initiative we have with the AI Growth Lab, to make sure that our regulatory context builds trust in a dynamic way over time.
Thank you very much indeed. Lady Chakrabarti, and then we've got some further questions.
Thank you, Chair. So, Minister, the committee's already heard from several witnesses who suggest that managing risk upstream, so right at the design and development stage of the AI life cycle, is the best approach to preventing human rights harms. Could you tell us how that risk, that upstream risk, is managed and monitored in the UK?
Right. So I think one of the things I'd really flag here is that we should talk about risks that are specific, because one of the views that we've taken is that when we are able to talk about the particular risks and harms that might be of concern, we're able to regulate it better. So AI developers will also be subject to the series of regulations that we have, whether that's from a privacy point of view through our existing legislation, data protection, Human Rights Act, the Public Sector Equality Duty when it's being deployed in the public sector, and indeed the Equalities Act more generally. And so the starting point is there is no difference as to whether a technology is AI technology or linear regression technology or other statistical methods as to the liability and responsibilities under existing pieces of legislation. That's the first point to say. The second point to say is that we have to make sure that we still build public sector capability to apply those pieces of legislation and those regimes of regulation appropriately to AI as well. That has been a big part of what we've been focused. As I mentioned in my prior response, the AI Security Institute complements the regulatory regimes we have with even further depth of understanding of these models prior to deployment. And I think you will have heard from some of the regulators, hopefully, but I'm aware that the AI Security Institute, for example, coordinates and speaks often to representatives in Ofcom, as do I, to try and make sure that Ofcom's regulatory functions are being appropriately deployed upstream, as well as subsequently in light of the information that it understands from other regulators and government bodies as well.
In your department's written evidence to the committee, it's stated that organisations deploying AI remain accountable for discriminatory outputs. I'm assuming that that includes government departments when they are deploying AI systems. Is that your position?
Yeah, and both in legislation and, of course, in terms of the Public Sector Equality Duty, which very much applies as well.
Okay, well, and the Public Sector Equality Duty is one thing. The Human Rights Act that you mentioned only applies to public authority, so there's a potential gap there in relation to private deployers of AI.
Well, as you'll be way more aware than me, private sector bodies are, of course, particularly in employment context, very much subject to the equalities provisions as well.
In the employment context, okay. At present, are there any mandatory conditions that must be met before AI systems can be deployed either in the public or the private sector? For example, disclosure requirements, impact assessments, declarations of compliance, and so on.
So, model developers are subject to a series of regulatory regimes that we have across the harm categories that I mentioned. I think in most of those cases, they have a liability to ensure that they don't do anything falling foul of the law. I don't have a single answer across the whole range of regimes as to whether all of them or some of them require mandatory disclosures ahead of time, but they are regulated in the usual ways across the range of harm categories. There is one area which is the ability to create child sexual abuse material, where we have deemed it particularly important to clarify that there's a distinct criminal liability position that model developers will be subject to, in addition to the wide range of regulatory burdens on them already.
And which UK regulators can currently block AI systems from being deployed if significant upstream risks have been identified?
I think I'd have to I guess the primary question that comes, the primary aspect that comes to my mind is that under the provisions of the Data Use and Access Act, we have specific conditions under which automated decision-making can take place. That feels like an obvious place where there is a preemptive requirement to satisfy very particular conditions of deployment, and in the absence of those conditions being met, automated decision-making deployment should not be taking place. If I think about other areas, I think a lot of the other areas of regulation rely on a liability regime where the regulator then assesses ex post compliance rather than ex ante, as is the case with other technologies too.
I think this is a concern, and this is something that we discussed with the regulators when they were sitting in your place a little while ago, of that we've got some very potent technology here, which is, I agree, potentially very beneficial, but potentially very harmful as well. And unlike, for example, medicines or other potent technology that can be used for good or ill, there isn't really a prior approval regime in this country, is there?
Yeah, I think what we've broadly done is, as with other statistical methods, and artificial intelligence is effectively a general purpose way of analyzing large volumes of data, we have a series of regulatory regimes, as I've mentioned, in most of those cases, the focus is on then assessing compliance with the regulation post-release. What we've done very distinctly here is to say, whilst it's not medicine, and yet it's much more similar to, say, the internet, what we have done nonetheless is say that we will build public sector capability very uniquely globally in the AI Security Institute to be able to work very closely with the large model developers internationally to still assess them pre-release and be able to support their work in mitigating risks pre-release. And that combination of robust regulatory enforcement ex post and this understanding and coordination ex ante feels to me an appropriate starting position. But of course, I take into account the points you're making.
Thank you. I think, Minister, you're taking us into the next area of questioning. So Desmond's going to ask you a question in a moment about the Council of Europe framework documents. And I should say that a number of members of the committee, Lord Murray and others, have been exploring this during a visit to Strasbourg and since then with members of the Council of Europe. And then I know that Lord Rook wants to take us on to further questions about the global arrangements that we can make and maybe touch on your experiences in India recently. But first of all, Sir Desmond.
So we signed up to the Council of Europe Convention framework 18 months ago. We've yet to ratify it. To be fair, none of the other signatories have ratified it yet. But is there anything that you're aware of that stands in our way in terms of being able to deliver on the commitments that currently prevents us from proceeding with that ratification?
I really appreciate that question. 2 points to make. One, just the introductory comment I'd make is that I was very glad, I think, across government, we're focused on the UK playing a significant role in international coordination on the question of risk mitigation in AI. And so the fact that it was the first legally binding agreement globally on AI grounded in human rights, democracy and the rule of law was a really important moment, and I'd be delighted to talk about how we've continued those conversations in India. On the particular question, as well, as you'll know very well, the convention largely focuses on existing human rights regimes within countries and to ensure that countries comply with them when it comes to the question of AI. And so to that extent, I feel no significant obstacles in us being able to put that into effect as well. It's just that the program of work required to do so, given the sweeping scope of it, is pretty extensive, and so we're making sure that we're working hard on that.
The extension of scope, as I understand it, is that where it places an obligation on governments not just to regulate public authorities and the private sector acting on behalf of public authorities, but on all private sector obligations. How is that to be achieved?
Well, I think we still have to work through how we make sure that what we've committed to, which is that as a country we want to make sure that AI is grounded in human rights, democracy and law. How we adapt that to our existing both law but also the regulatory regime we have, which is primarily sector-led rather than sweeping cross-economy horizontal, is the thing that we're working through. So whether it ends up being the scope expansion that you're describing or not, I think is an open question still.
Thank you.
Do you see a gap in our current regulation of AI products and AI deployment of those products?
Yeah, so one gap that I think we felt, taking a very harms-focused approach, was that we felt, not least through conversations across Parliament as well, that when it came to the question of online safety, there was a potential gap related to risk for AI chatbots that weren't in scope of the Online Safety Act. So currently user-to-user engagement, cert services and regulated porn services are in scope of the Online Safety Act. But AI chatbots that don't involve user-to-user engagement or don't involve live search were not. Now, largely speaking, a lot of the risk association was already with chatbots in scope of the Act, but we felt that there was a theoretical possibility that there'd be some gaps in that. And so we have sought permissive powers in the Crime and Policing Bill to be able to make sure that we have the powers to close any of those gaps as well.
Those gaps include the kind of tragedies that we've seen of people consulting AI as to how to commit a suicide, and then one young person doing precisely that.
Yeah. The thing I'd say is it's firstly absolutely horrific, and one of the motivations to making sure that we were able to move fast on A, reviewing any gaps, and then B, seeking this power to move very fast on it, was exactly the testimony of both parents in particular. The Secretary of State and I met a series of bereaved families who had had those experiences, I have to clarify, not in the context of AI chatbots, but more generally online experiences. The second thing I'd say is that we found that one of the first things that the Secretary of State did when the two of us were appointed was to deem self-harm and suicide content in the Online Safety Act a priority offence, which now means that platforms don't just have a retrospective duty to react to that content, but a proactive requirement to look for it and to root it out. And that applies also to AI chatbots in scope of the Online Safety Act. Where AI chatbots are not in scope, as I mentioned, we have sought the permissive power to now be able to bring them in scope.
Thank you. Let's go to Lord Rook and then to Dame Chi.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you and I have had the conversation before about the pride we can take in this country sort of leading on AI safety, and the previous government's work to convene the Safety Summit at Bletchley Park. I had the privilege of working particularly with faith communities and civil society groups to look at how we could harness AI for human flourishing, but also to protect against potential harms. And clearly as a country, we were at the forefront of trying to convene the world in that conversation. I'm interested, hearing you straight back from India, despite the jet lag, to know where you think that conversation is right now. Are we still using international collaboration to deal with some of these challenges and opportunities? And also, are we as a country still taking a leading role in trying to push that conversation forward?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, because I think it goes to the heart of how we're able to move, especially in a technological context, which is much more global than specific sectors, how we're able to move together. I think one overarching observation I'd make about how the conversation has shifted, and then a specific question on our commitment. In terms of the overarching development, the thing I experienced in India was that where we were at Bletchley Park, which was a remarkable moment of UK leadership, and I have to commend cross-party and across governments, the work of the last government in doing so. Where we've moved to now is that the conversation is much more focused on the day-to-day experience of people, rather than much more abstract, very long-term questions of how AI might either fundamentally transform the economy long-term or fundamentally might pose risks. It's much more rooted in the lived experience of people now. That is exactly what I felt in India. So on the question of adoption and opportunity, the argument was not how you create massive large language models with billions and billions of investment, but how you create small models deployed on people's devices, giving them privacy as well as the power in their palms for billions of people in conditions of economic deprivation. And similarly, on the risk question, the focus was very much on not just saying, hey, AI is a kind of cross-sector, massive global long-term risk, but much more about what are risks that we're experiencing today. Look at the lens of harm and then regulate or make progress on mitigating those harms. And so we had some very fruitful conversations with both the Indian government and a series of other governments to, in particular, look at, for example, the question of child safety, the question of violence against women and girls. Very acute risks. People are experiencing them here and now. And all of us are trying to move promptly on those questions. And I found that a very helpful shift from where I think the conversation was to where the conversation is now, much more in sync with the lived experience of people. The second thing on the question of commitment, British commitment, is that we are absolutely committed to making sure the UK continues to play a leading role in the international conversation here. Part of that is through the ongoing capability of the AI Security Institute and an alignment fund that we have now committed to with partner countries, which remains the forefront of a lot of the state of the science in understanding risks. But part of it is also engaging very deeply with allies in thinking about how we're moving in an appropriate way when it comes to wider questions of multilateral governance. And in that question, I will also just simply say that the question of how we engage all of society, and in particular spiritual groups, the wider communities that we have, is increasingly at the heart of it, because I felt that the prior conversation at Bletchley was a very insular, elite conversation. I think there are 250 people or so there talking about super long-term risk and opportunities of AI. At the Indian Summit, there were 250,000 people there, including faith leaders as well. And I think that was reflected in the fact that we're now talking much more about specific opportunities, specific harms, and specific mitigations.
That's very helpful, thank you. Some of us are hearing rumours, which we're hoping are just rumours, that our eagerness in the UK to progress a kind of tech prosperity deal with the USA might be leading us to be less connected with other countries around the world and reduce our international engagement and really just kind of back the US as the main horse in this race. Interested to know your perspective on that. Are we attaching ourselves more strongly to the US, or are we still working with other global actors, particularly on issues of AI safety? And also, are we actively involved in looking at how AI safety protects human rights in different constituencies around the world?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. The United States is, of course, a very key ally for us when it comes to the question of technology. That said, I've personally spent time in both South Korea and now India. When I was in India, I didn't just meet the Indian government, I met the Australian minister, I met the French minister, I met the Norwegian minister, and beyond as well. And that was precisely because we want to make sure the UK continues to play a role, not just in our bilateral engagement with the United States, but much more broadly as well. And on the broader question you raised, I will flag that the work that we are doing on AI safety and security more generally is very much conscious of the impacts that other countries and people right across the world are experiencing too. And that is part of the reason why, not just through the Alignment Fund, but more generally through a series of engagements. One of the things I did in India was the UK led the effort alongside Professor Yoshua Bengio to make sure that we launched the International AI Safety Report. It was a report where the Secretariat was in the UK and both Professor Bengio and I were present at the event to show that the UK remains a really important contributor to that conversation globally.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Let's go to Dame Chi and then to my colleague, Dr. Peter Swallow.
Thank you very much. And Kanishka, it's great to have you here. And I know you have a lot of experience in AI from before you entered Parliament. And I do want to ask you about the current regulatory framework. But did I hear you say that AI was just another statistical analysis model? I think you might cause a AI market crash if you're saying it only analysis as opposed to content generation.
I think what I was saying is that it is general purpose in the way that, say, statistical methods are, by which I mean effectively it is a way of having data inputs then be used to generate very material and range of outputs. Now, of course, linear regression is much more limited in its scope as a statistical method, but we shouldn't think of this as some radically new magical thing. It is simply the pretty significant advance in capability, but at the heart of it, a kind of algorithmic method that is not novel.
It may not be radically new as a technology, and I'd agree with that, but its impacts are new.
Sure.
And through the inquiry, we've heard evidence that the current regulatory framework for AI in the UK is fragmented. Back in 2023, the predecessor Science, Innovation and Technology Committee asked for a regulatory gap analysis for AI. And when we had the Secretary of State, Liz Kendall, before the current committee, she promised to bring in appropriate legislation to address any gaps in AI regulation and in the framework. So has that regulatory gap analysis been completed to your knowledge? And if so, what were the findings and recommendations?
The main thing I'd say on this, Chi, is also that looking from a harms-based point of view, we have said, where are there gaps? So in this context, for example, on online safety, as I mentioned earlier, we found that there was a potential gap, and we put in place legislative measures to be able to act on it very promptly, as you'll know very well.
So you've done a harms-based regulatory gap analysis?
Well, what I haven't seen is a single sort of look that says where are gaps on AI. What we have done is said on online safety, which is
and identified it.
Well, so on online safety, we've said we have a significant regulatory regime in place. Are there any gaps that are correlated with real-world risk? We found one, and we acted on it. And so that's largely been the approach, which is to take the example of where there are experiences of people that we think aren't currently regulated appropriately, and to act promptly to stamp them out.
How are you identifying where there are experiences of people which aren't currently regulated?
Yeah, so a combination of ways. One, in the context of online safety, for example, which is... Sorry.
I mean, you've talked about that, but I'm thinking about other examples.
Yeah,
that's
one
example.
I talked about child safety and online safety, but if you want me to park that, I can park the rest of online safety. Broadly speaking, in parts of the portfolio that I'm responsible for, and as I said, we take a generally sector-specific view. What we've said is both through engagement with the public. I engage very often with civil society groups as well. We have tried to say, where are there gaps and how can we plug them? And second, in most of our regulatory regimes, we have a systematic process of review, monitoring, and evaluation, which also yields a clear understanding of where there are risks that are currently not being effectively countered. And so the combination of those things, systematic reviews, but alongside a pretty clear sense of being attuned to ongoing feedback, we, I think, are in a position to regulate where it's needed.
So every regulator has done a review of gaps in current regulation with regard to AI harms.
Well, I certainly wouldn't be in a position to tell you if regulators completely outside the scope of my department would have done so, but I'm happy to engage with them and try and write to you on it.
I suppose that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Because whilst you're the Minister for AI impacts every sector of every department. Yep. So I think I understand what you're saying to us is that you are perhaps confident that about potential regulatory gaps for current harms within DCIT, but not within other sectors.
I think that's right. You know, as hopefully you'll have heard, the privacy regulator says, I regulate privacy as a harm vector, but I don't regulate specific technologies. And I would really hope the privacy regulator both looks at AI, but non-AI harms. If you think about equalities, I would hope that the equalities regulator looks at possible vector of exposure from AI, but non-AI as well.
I understand that, Minister, but I do feel that AI, and we are looking at AI, AI has specific, it can be complex and its implications should be considered across government. But I suppose that brings me to your level of responsibility. So are you responsible? Do you have a responsibility for AI across government, or purely within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology?
I'm just going to clarify the question. So what I'm definitely not responsible for is public service deployment of AI. My colleague, Minister Murray, is in charge of public service deployment of AI. Right. And so, but of course, I'd be happy to try and answer any questions on that. I think if the question is more broadly, there are some aspects, labour market impacts, the future work unit, which does sit in my portfolio, but that is not just across public sector, that is across economy question.
So for example, a question of the ethics of using AI in benefits analysis. Is there anyone in government who is responsible for high standards of ethics or any standards of ethics in AI deployment across government or across sectors?
Very importantly so, yes. So in the question of benefits analysis, the DWP has a series of requirements to make sure that when it's deploying technology, including AI, that it is able to cater to not just regulation, but the public sector equality duty. If the question is more broadly, is someone responsible not for sector-specific aspects, but cross-public sector aspects?
No, it's for cross-government aspects. Is anyone responsible for ensuring certain standards of ethics or other best practice across government when it comes to AI?
So just to, without hoping to repeat too much, it is very much the case that each department is responsible for ethics and regulations, and on top of that, the Government Digital Service works on a series of standards across government, including an AI playbook that is working on to make sure that departments are able to share best practice as well. So we have both intensive sector-specific deployment responsibilities for departments, but alongside that, the Government Digital Service in its usual role, with oversight from Minister Murray, my colleague, has a sense of kind of looking at standards across government as well.
What powers does it have to enforce those standards across government?
I'm happy to write to you on that. It's not in my portfolio, so I'm afraid I don't have a full view of it.
Thank you, Minister. That's very helpful. Do you have any further points you want to?
I did just want to have a quick question on the AISI, the December 25 report when every single system was overcome by jailbreak testing. Do you feel confident that the UK can address the challenges posed by AI frontier systems? And is there plans to place it on a statutory footing? And sort of while you're responding to that question, you just say why they changed the name from AI Safety Institute to Security Institute.
Great. On the three questions, first, why don't I take the last first? So Of course, it preceded me, and so I will largely pass on second-hand information. But the change in name was reflective of the fact that AI, as a general-purpose technology, increasingly had national security implications, and we wanted to make sure that those implications were very much front of mind for the Institute, as well as it increasingly concentrated its work not just on questions of imminent safety, but also questions of imminent national security. And as a reflection of that, the name was changed. I'm sure it had some implications also for our ability to attract particular types of talent. You'll have no doubt seen that the new leadership at the AI Security Institute has come from contexts that have experienced national security assessments in depth as well. We found that was a very important function to have inside government. On the first question of confidence in light of the report that you mentioned, the main thing I'd say is that the AI Security Institute has some of the world's most exceptional talent in being able to assess models. And to that extent, the fact that the UK government has built that capability, retained and grown that capability, is a very unique source of strength for us in understanding risk, engaging early and upstream in being able to work with developers and labs to mitigate those risks and to build cross-government understanding, not least, as I mentioned, in the child safety context, for us to take action where we think more action is merited and appropriate. And so, given that, I would never be in a position of complacency to tell you that I feel deeply confident. I, of course, worry about this as I worry about a number of risks across the portfolio. But I think the combination of those functions gives me some assurance. And then on your second question about statutory, I feel at the moment that the AI Security Institute is unparalleled globally in its access to models pre-deployment globally as well. And I have seen no reason to suggest that its institutional design requires reform to enhance that access and its capabilities in any way. But of course, I'd be very keen on keeping it under review if there are alternative views on that question.
That's very helpful. I'm sorry, Denchi, we do need to move on from there. But if you are keeping that under review, I think we'd want to hear more about it. Dr. Swallow, and then after that we're going to turn to Lord Murray.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to ask you a very simple and single question. What is sovereign AI?
It is always a pleasure to answer a single, simple question to which there is no simple, single response, but I shall try nonetheless. My personal dictionary definition is the ability for a state to have strategic leverage when it comes to this technology, such that it can ensure ongoing access to critical inputs, ongoing assurance that its wider economic and national security objectives can be met more broadly.
So we've set up the UK's Sovereign AI unit. How many UK-based companies have been contracted to deliver services by that unit?
I wish I had a more assuring answer for you, but the Sovereign AI unit is a very recent phenomenon. We have just secured money for it. We are hoping to officially launch it in a few weeks' time. And so far the work of the unit has been very limited. It is just very nascent. And so we're focused very much at the moment on hiring, on governance, on setting up of the unit. That said, in order to get those design questions right, we have already started to engage with some companies. I'm aware, for example, just a few months ago that I announced engagement with a couple of British AI for Science companies, specifically in terms of compute facility that the unit had, but also that through our wider data initiatives on protein folding and open bind that we've engaged with UK researchers and startups as well. I'd be very happy to write to the committee with a list of companies that have so far been engaged.
Very helpful, thank you.
That's really helpful, and you'll appreciate, Minister, why I'm sort of asking these questions. You'll know where I'm going with this. Lord Rook referenced it earlier. There is a view that the UK cannot possibly hope to compete with the US and with China when it comes to AI. There is a view that the UK doesn't have the kinds of companies that we need to have in order to have a genuinely sovereign AI capability. I know from speaking to you before this and from my own experience as a constituency MP with some fantastic AI companies in my patch that is not necessarily the case, but obviously there is a role for government here to foster and grow the AI capability that we have in the UK. So just what is your view on this? How do we get that balance right between fostering genuinely sovereign AI capability whilst also recognising that, of course, we do need to work with international companies, particularly those based in ally states? Where do you see the balance between those two?
Yeah. Well, the first thing, I think this is an absolutely critical question. So the first thing to say is I think this is the most important question that I think about when it comes to the trajectory of this country on AI. Because increasingly not just economic power, but hard material power and a huge series of areas of influence are determined by the quality of our position on this technology. And so that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that when I think about sovereignty as I defined it, which is strategic leverage more broadly, you get strategic leverage through, I think, 3 steps on the ladder. One is just have enough of the critical inputs. Right? Like, yes, think about, I'll come to all the other aspects of where it's from, but just have enough of them. Have enough of the chips so you can even do anything with AI in the first instance. And so in that context, we were very keen that we were able to secure the level of capital investment that meant Britain was at least on the table. Once you're on the table, the second part of it is to make sure that you have some diversification in who you're procuring critical inputs from so that you can bargain effectively. With the Party of Labour, we understand that who has power matters as much as what the powers are. And so for that context, we have focused, one of the first things I did was to engage with a series of companies in every part of the stack so that we were able to build some diversity into the landscape. And then the third rung of the ladder is ultimately to build British, to make sure that we have the full fat version of sovereign capability here in parts of the stack. You are right to say that we don't have that across the entire stack. I would say gently that I think we do have it in parts of the stack. Arm is the leading chip design company globally, headquartered still in Cambridge. We have fantastic companies growing up in the inference AI chip part of it, Fractal and Olix being 2. When it comes to models, we have huge strengths, not just in the fact that a lot of the Gemini teams sit in DeepMind and King's Cross, but in AI for science, in AI for autonomous vehicles. Wave just raised the largest funding round in Europe just this year today, $1.5 billion. It is a fantastic company looking at embodied AI and vision models. And so there are lots of specialist areas of science in particular where we have very remarkable capability that gives us leverage. And then the third aspect is applied AI as well. Well, I think we have some very significant strengths, not least because we have been building areas of trustworthy AI and assured AI as well. So the second thing to say is that I think there is some mix of procuring from outside to have enough of this stuff, procuring from some diversified sources, and then, yes, ultimately building British. And then
would you accept that historically we haven't been good enough at procuring from UK companies?
Without a doubt. You know, if you look at it over the commercial cloud wave, frankly, you know, I am very glad that there are lots of companies that we benefit from, which are international companies, and we will continue to do so. But the fact that we have been so susceptible to a very limited presence in that part of the stack from the UK has been a challenge. Now, does that mean that we should attack that part of the stack? Not necessarily. It's an economic decision. Ultimately, we have finite resources. We have to pick our areas of focus. But it is pretty clear to me that broadly speaking, Britain lost out in the last 15 years of software as a service and cloud development, and I'm very determined that we don't do so now. And so the third part of your question is, what can government do? The Sovereign AI Unit is specifically focused on using both capital and compute to anchor British companies here. But that is only a part of the solution. We have not just a role in terms of compute and capital through Sovereign AI and British Business Bank sources, but we have a role also as a customer. And I think in that context, one of the early things that we did just 3-4 months ago was to announce a advanced market commitment where government will say to British startups in novel chips, as you unlock technical risk by developing new technologies, you will unlock incremental government revenue. And when you do that, you can raise a lot more money from private markets as a result of doing it. So government has a huge role to play in being much more innovative as a customer as well.
Briefly on AI growth labs, where the government is looking to allow AI systems to be tested within safe sandboxes where some of the regulation is taken away in order to test novel uses of AI. Are you confident that human rights concerns are being tested as part of that process, as part of that sandboxing?
Really important question. One of the things that we consulted on in the consultation was to make sure that we solicited views on regulatory red lines. Human rights, workers' rights, intellectual property rights were three that were really top of mind for me when I thought about that. But we want to make sure that we're creating, yes, permission in cases where we think innovation from an assured, responsible way can progress the economy, but to do so with no compromise on fundamental values and rights as well.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm being advised that there may be a division in the Lords in due course, so occupational hazard. So we may have to suspend at that point. But I want, if I may now, to turn to Lord Murray, and after that we will hear from Lord Sewell. But building on the answer you've just given to Dr. Swallow, when things go wrong, what happens about remedies? And I think that Lord Murray wants to pursue that.
Yes. In your view, Minister, are the United Kingdom's current arrangements to provide redress for harms caused by AI, as required by the Framework Convention, presently sufficient?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always wary of assuring the committee that I've looked across the entire economy, but broadly speaking, there are a series of civil liability regimes under existing regulatory frameworks as well. So, of course, if you suffer loss or injury in connection with the use of AI, then compensation through the courts, through both contract and tort, can be sought there. Alongside that, we have a series of frameworks, the data protection frameworks, for example, which apply to AI when it involves the processing of personal data. And in that context, as you'll know very well, parties have to make sure, data controllers have to make sure that any processing is lawful, fair, transparent. The ICO has a relatively clear redressal process, as well as a process for subject access requests, which allows individuals to seek both transparency on their data and redressal in the event of non-compliance with law. I don't propose to go through it harm by harm, but broadly speaking, we have redressal mechanisms across the regulatory regimes that apply to AI. Some of them work much better from a capacity and efficiency point of view than others, and it remains, of course, an important task for us to make sure that we're levelling all of them up as well.
So what you're suggesting is there are really two routes, aren't there? There's a civil litigation route and an information commissioner data processing.
That is only because I stopped going through each category of harm, but if you wanted to take another instance, for example, if you look at online safety, platforms have the liability to ensure that they're acting on illegal content as well as child safety duties. In the context of redressal, individuals and trusted flaggers can flag harms in those contexts as well, and when they relate to systems and processes, Ofcom can then take them up as well. We've created this trusted flagger mechanism for redressal there as well. If I then think about employment, of course, in the employment context, if there is non-compliance, there are redressal mechanisms through the law there as well. So,
obviously, it's another route of litigation.
Right. Yeah.
So of those three principal routes, are you satisfied that there is sufficient capacity within those mechanisms to address what might be massive scalability of harm from AI systems, given the increase in the use of AI?
Yeah, really important question. One of the things I worry about is that automation on the offender side moves faster than automation and capacity as a result on the defender side. And so one of the things that I'm really focused on is how we build capability in the regulatory enforcement mechanisms that we have to keep up with that. We have recently announced an AI capability fund through the Regulatory Innovation Office to make sure that regulators are able to do so. I've personally, in the context that I know best, which is Ofcom and the online safety part of my portfolio, seen that the hiring of machine learning engineers has very significantly increased in that regulator. But it is, of course, a question that I reflect on quite a bit and remains an ongoing area of concern.
So the department's assessment of the adequacy of private law and consumer protection legislation is on the ministerial dashboard, but it's blinking yellow rather than green.
Well, I as the minister who's not in charge of how the process works, I wouldn't wish to comment on my justice colleagues' behalf, but certainly from a kind of cross-sector point of view, my instinctive view is that we need to keep a very close eye on this question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to continue the question?
Yes, I'm just going to move briefly on to procurement and the use by the government of AI in the procurement processes. are you satisfied that government procurement processes are sufficiently using AI as a tool to improve procurement processes? And how do you go about monitoring that use as DCIT to ensure that it's being used well and uniformly across government departments?
Yeah. So if I take each part of that question, are we using it enough and are we using it well? On the question of are we using it well, again, I'm reluctant to opine on behalf of my colleague whose oversight of the GDS, the Government Digital Service, would probably put Minister Murray in a better position to answer it. Broadly speaking, the Government Digital Service ensures that there are common standards and a playbook for the deployment of AI in different parts of the public sector as a way of ensuring good standards, best practice is shared across the board, and indeed as part of that, that compliance with a range of responsibilities that government bodies have, whether that's data protection and privacy under UK GDPR, whether it's information security and auditability under provisions and standards of the NCSC, or whether it's specific rights in the context of either equality and fairness, broadly, that those are complied with. And so that's the framework. I don't have a specific position on whether an assessment has been made of the quality of that. And then in the question of whether it has been used enough, my broad view is that I think the opportunity is vast here, and we're absolutely keen on grabbing it. It would be very remiss of me to say that I am satisfied with progress as of today. I want us to go much further, much faster.
And in terms of the perspective from this inquiry in relation to this committee, are you satisfied that the mechanisms within the procurement processes suitably consider the question of due diligence measures to protect human rights? So I'm thinking particularly of procurement of tech in the most obvious sense.
Yeah, I'm very happy to share again. I don't mean to avoid responsibility, but simply to avoid credit, which is to say that having not had oversight of public sector procurement and AI in that context, I will flag that across HMG we use standardized legal contracts for procurement of software services across the board. And in doing so, we have particular regard to both strict mandatory clauses in those contracts, standards that are shared across government in those contracts, and a robust risk management framework that looks specifically at data protection and privacy. It looks at information security and auditability. It looks at the questions of privacy and fairness in a standardized way as well. And so my expectation is that that is a relatively robust, mandatory, standardized approach across government. Of course, in all of these contexts, it is always as good as the quality of the people and the enforcement of it. I'm very happy to write to the committee on the question of where there is any assessment of that.
Obviously, you're familiar with the DWP 2024 example when an algorithm used to identify potential instances of benefit fraud was found to be producing discriminatory outcomes. Clearly, the reason that came to the government's attention was because of the efforts of NGOs challenging that. What lessons have been fed into government procurement processes to prevent that kind of situation recurring?
Yeah, I at a very high level have seen the DDP instance, but the broad view I'd say is that the UK GDPR, as well as, in this particular context, the public sector equality duty places a particular duty on government bodies. I can't remember, for not having, again, been the responsible minister, whether that was an AI model or whether it was actually just a linear regression model. I'm very happy to write back to the committee, having consulted the DWP on it. But the big picture lesson is, of course, very, very clear, which is that we want to make sure the standards that we have, the standardized contracts that we have, are properly enforced across government departments, and those include a very specific focus on ensuring compliance with the equality duty and avoiding any discriminatory outcomes of the sort that has been described. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, I'm going to turn to Sir Desmond Swayne, if I may, in a moment, because I know he wants to ask about guardrails. But before we leave this area entirely, Dr. Swallow asked you earlier on about sandboxes, and I'm advised that human rights regulations will not be turned off in sandboxes, but will AI systems be tested for possible risks they pose to human rights? And again, if you don't feel able to answer that now, then I'm very happy for that to be added to the note to the committee subsequently.
Sure. The specific sandbox that I described, the AI Growth Lab, has not been designed in certainty yet. We have just consulted on the design of it. one of the key principles of the consultation was to solicit views on how we ensure regulatory red lines, as they relate to rights in particular, were maintained in the design of it. And so when we do complete the design of the sandbox in that context, I'm very happy to write to the committee at that point to assure the committee of where the red lines have been.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Sir Desmond and then Lord Sewell.
What guardrails are in place or would be in place to prevent the disruption to a public service were the processing discovered to be non-compliant in respect of the AI that was being used? How would we ensure that the public service continued to be provided?
Yeah. I don't have the fullest legal view on this, but if I just play the hypothetical scenario forward, I think the situation being described is of AI being used in some context, it being found through its live deployment that the processing of personal data was non-compliant, a report having been made, I guess, to the ICO in that particular instance of harm, and the ICO finding that the technology was non-compliant. In that instance, the ICO, I would assume, would then go through its enforcement process, which would include the possibility of enforcing fines and corrective remedies. If it were the case that none of the corrective remedies for the processing of personal data were possible alongside the maintenance of the service provision, I suspect there would have to be a period of transition from that system to another system in parallel to avoid breaks in continuity whilst maintaining the enforcement process. So all of that to say that I'm very much veering outside of my scope of understanding of the legal context here, but I would assume that we would have to make sure that we were both running the enforcement process and the service transition process in parallel to avoid a material break in continuity where it would threaten continuity of an essential service.
Yeah, I was thinking more in terms of the having thought through the need for a backup system to replace that processing were it found to be non-compliant. But let's say it's a military recruitment system or something of that sort. There would need to be in place a backup, a recovery system.
I think that's an important point about resilience of procurement context more generally as well, and I entirely agree with it.
Thank you very much. Data assessment, I think now Lord Sewell.
Data assets, yeah. The government has clarified its intention to build a national data library and leverage, and this is a sort of way in which they can have some leverage in health data and held by the NHS as an asset to promote collaboration between the UK and investors and developers. How will the National Data Library ensure, two things. One, that individuals' privacy rights are not violated, and secondly, bias within national data sets does not translate into discriminatory outputs?
No, this is a really central question. The starting point is that the National Data Library, I think, is a very ambitious government programme. We've backed it with over £100 million, and the intent there is to create effectively a very efficient, effective way of allowing public data sets to be used for public research in particular, and the Health Data Research Service is a very important part of that in the first instance. On the particular question of protections of privacy, we have set out new guidelines for AI-ready government data sets more broadly, and those guidelines are precisely focused on how responsible development takes place using those data sets. They require human oversight at key stages to protect privacy rights. They require a duty to prevent bias. They require that people, rather than just machines, are accountable for decisions that matter as well. And that is all alongside the range of existing regulatory responsibilities that apply, of course, to the public sector use as well as private sector use of any data as well. So we are very conscious that, yes, we have existing duties, but in the case of data usage for AI, we have decided it worthwhile to set out even further guidance to ensure that those regulatory responsibilities are carried out with granular guidance as well.
Are you really happy, genuinely, are you really happy with that framework?
Yeah, I think it's untested at the moment because the National Data Library is very new, but I think we've worked incredibly hard intensively across different parts of government, as well as with experts externally, and have engaged very widely. But if there are, of course, questions that others want to raise about the quality of that guidance, I'd always be very keen on hearing them as well.
Thank you very much. Baroness Chakrabarti, and then we'll go to Lord Murray.
Thanks, Chair. So the Data Use and Access Act removes most of the previous GDPR restrictions on automated decision-making. So these restrictions now only apply to the most sensitive types of personal data. Minister, why was this decision made?
Just to clarify, what the Data Use and Access Act changes do is effectively say that we will not place specific scope constraints on where automated decision making is allowed, but all the protections that existed prior, many of those protections will continue to apply in a very material way. And so solely, the protections around people being informed of when automated decision making is taking place. 2, their ability to contest it when they feel a decision has not been appropriate. 3, the ability to secure human intervention in the use of that sort of decision making. And so the robust set of entitlements and protections that people have had prior in the use of solely automated decision making continue to apply, alongside, of course, the existing set of responsibilities in terms of equalities, privacy, and beyond as well. And so the intent there was effectively to say that we didn't feel, especially for this new technology, that prescribing on the face of legislation where it should or should not be applied was the right way to go about it. The right way to go about it was to make sure that where it is applied, that appropriate protections were available in terms of rights to individuals to ensure their safe and responsible usage.
And so you're satisfied of the human rights, the robustness of human rights protection despite that deregulation?
Well, on the face of it, I'd say what we have done is the most important parts of the regulation, which were focused on the protection of human rights in any of these cases. We have absolutely maintained, or we're absolutely focused on ensuring that they are carried out. Now, as to the question of whether I'm satisfied on the whole, I think a huge amount of this remains a question of enforcement quality as well. And I wouldn't be in a complacent position to say it's a one and done question. We continue to be very focused on it. But I've hopefully set out a rationale that says we have put the protection of rights in the provision of the law front and centre.
Are there any areas of life where you think decisions about people should not be automated?
So I think the existing data protection framework that we have effectively says that we should only consider processing, and automated systems will require large-scale processing of data where it is proportionate, where it is fair. And so there are a number of areas, I wouldn't propose to go through all of them, where those tests are unlikely to be met. And even when they are met, that they should only be done so in a way that allows individuals still the ability to be A, informed, B, contest, and C, secure human intervention as well.
Is the government considering removing any other rights protections or considering any further deregulation as part of its AI ambitions?
Just to be very clear, Baroness, this was not, to my view, a removal of any rights to the first framing of your question. As I mentioned, the protections for individual rights remain very much in place in the law. It is deeply important that we do so. On the question more broadly of deregulation, of course, we are looking at a series of instances where we think regulation can be smarter still, can allow regulators to move dynamically, to be better off in being able to enforce regulatory outcomes in a way that is different. The cross-economy sandbox that I'd mentioned is very much part of that. I'm hoping some of the individual sector regulators have talked to you about their sandbox environments as well, the intent of which is effectively to achieve robust regulatory outcomes without necessarily static prescription of activity.
I mean, what they did say, the regulators, and 3 of them's out there, was that there isn't one of them who has the power to say about a new product, this product should not be used. Not one of them is able to give approval or disapproval for a new AI product.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, a huge amount of the focus in this area and others has been on liability regimes, regulatory regimes that operate robustly in being able to tackle harms. A number of those are ex post. What we have done very uniquely here is also created a capability for ex-ante assessment and coordination with the companies to make sure we're mitigating some of the most acute harms as well.
Thank you. Lord Murray.
Yes. On automated decision making, there are 4 safeguards which are meant to be in place, including the right to meaningful information and the right to contest the output. In practice, how are these 4 safeguards monitored?
Well, Murray, you are very much asking me to veer outside my realm of understanding, so I'm happy to write to you on this question as to how they're enforced in practice and any assessments that have taken place of compliance with it.
Perhaps you could also, when you write, just cover this question, which is that if the safeguards are not adequately provided, how can individuals complain and seek redress? Perhaps you could.
Yeah, I will.
As well. And I'm conscious that a division has just been called in the Lords. And
Before I suspend the sitting, though, I wonder if colleagues would agree, out of politeness to the Minister, who not only has been jet lagged, but has been giving very freely of his time this afternoon, rather than keeping him here, because I'm told there may be 2 divisions, so we don't want to have you hanging around to answer just 2 more questions. You have very kindly agreed to write to us about a number of things. If we were to give you those 2 other questions, one is Dame Cheese, one is mine, if they could be added to your letter, and if I could now prevail upon you to ensure that we get a reply to those questions fairly quickly, because we need to move on to our draft report and we need your replies to be able to do that. So if your officials could really help in ensuring we get a reply within a reasonable time frame in the next week or so, that would be really appreciated. But if you're happy on that basis, I would be very happy to now suspend the sitting, but by saying thank you very much indeed, Minister Narayan, for giving us your time today. I've been very personally impressed by the way in which you've answered our questions, the competence that you've shown in your portfolio, and the deep knowledge you clearly have. And I think people should feel comforted that someone who is on top of his brief has been appearing before this select committee today.
No, very much appreciate that, Chair, and thank you for your generosity in considering my time. I will hope to reciprocate the generosity of my time of responses as well. So
thank you very much indeed. And in that case, I can formally end today's meeting because we dealt with all the private business earlier on. But if people, any members wish, we don't have to be quorate, wish to come back after the divisions are over, Professor Young is available to come and talk to us as our special advisor on this committee, on this inquiry, and Karen is sitting modestly over there. She'll be happy to brief us about some of the replies that we've heard today. But with those words, let me end this session.